And I'm like, surely there's historical evidence for Jesus. And I had somebody challenge me on that, like, well, why don't you provide me the evidence? And so I went looking for it. Were you the crazy snake handler kind of Pentecostal?
No. We don't have that.
Okay.
That's like an American phenomenon. I'm pretty sure.
This is one instance where there's a direct connection between the two, where John is refuting these prior gospels. Whoever wrote like the Pentateuch, the Old Testament, do you think that they were trying to deceive like the Jews when they wrote about the Garden of Eden, or they wrote about Noah's flood, or anything like that?
Welcome to Deep Drinks Podcast, where the drinks are deep and the conversations are deeper.
Welcome everyone to Deep Drinks Podcast. This is where the drinks are deep and the conversations are deeper. My name is Dave, and today we have John, Godless Engineer, with us. John runs the popular YouTube channel Godless Engineer, where he engages in atheist activism, where he hopes to help those who are losing or have lost their faith not feel so alone. John is a Jesus Mythicist, which is the position that the story of Jesus is a piece of mythology, possessing no substantial claims to historical fact. There are a few different flavors of Jesus Mythicism, which we will learn all about today. As you may know, Godless Engineer from his appearances on The Line, Cosmic Skeptics channel, Apologia, Mythvision podcast, and many, many more. John and I started chatting for the first time when I made some inflammatory remarks about Jesus Mythicists on Twitter, where I was taken onto John's show and stood trial for not knowing anything about the topic I was ridiculing. Despite a few tense moments, we ended the conversation on friendly terms, and now it's time to learn more about Jesus Mythicism. So I welcome John Gleason, Godless Engineer, to Deep Drinks Podcast. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I was really excited when you asked me to, be interviewed by you on here. And I always love talking with people just about mythicism, but just in general, I love interacting and really just engaging with like-minded persons.
Yeah, it's interesting, dude, because I was looking at, I'm not sure when you updated your about section on your YouTube channel, but I really liked how you mentioned that, when you first started losing your faith, you felt really alone, and you felt like you didn't have anyone to kind of bounce your ideas off and stuff. And that's the kind of, is it still a driving force that kind of drives you forward in your YouTube channel to like create that environment for people to kind of explore their faith and explore their lack of faith and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I always want to try to provide a sort of community, or at least a space where people feel like they can, ask questions, even if they're, a little inflammatory. Sometimes I let that get the better of me, but I try to be a really good conversationalist and just try to educate people on different things, at least how I view the world. And I listen to other people and what they say. Sometimes I adopt certain points of view. Sometimes I'm not convinced of it, so I reject it. And it's always having a good exchange of thoughts is the way that you continue to grow and really figure out who you are. So I try my best to provide that through any of my social media. And I think I do a somewhat decent job of it.
Has your position on any one topic changed throughout your YouTube career? Like, have you had any, through having these conversations with people, have you had like a shift in your perspective?
Well, I don't know what it was like for you if you were ever religious, but coming out of religion, I what am I trying to say here? Coming out of religion, I was very angry. I wasn't angry because I felt lied to or anything like that, but I felt angry just because it's like, well, I don't believe in these things. And then, I've got people that are coming at me saying, oh, you should believe in those things. And so it was kind of like spurring that kind of anger. And so, I would post like cringy I would make and post cringy sort of atheist memes and everything like that.
Yeah.
And I think I've really softened in my messaging for the most part, except for, this past year when I've gone a little bit harder at it again. As far as the politics goes, it's not really so much the religion discussion that I've really gone hard with. It's more politics that I've kind of taken like a pretty hard line position about, being conservative or liberal. And, as far as the conservatives here, like in the United States, they're getting a little bit out of control. But as far as like,
really?
Yes. Like, no shit.
Oh, I've noticed. They seem quite reasonable.
Yeah. But that's one big thing that I've changed is how I relate to religious people, how I relate to other atheists in general. I do my best to try to set a good example of how to, I guess, present yourself in a discussion, whether that be, having an open mind and gently talking to somebody about why they're wrong and stuff, or if it's, taking a very hard line, we're not having this kind of discussion on this topic kind of position. And I guess being a little bit more of an asshole, because I think that, there are definitely lines that you can draw as far as like, well, I'll be reasonable and have conversations with you up until this point. And then if you cross that line, I'm going to have to pull out the asshole. Is how I see it. So knowing where that line is for you is kind of important. I try to stress that for everybody, not just to when to be an asshole, but like where's that line for you as far as when to stop the conversation as well. And so I do try to be a good role model, I guess, for that kind of thing, because I always wanted somebody to look up to that would, either that would be really confident in their position and would know when to take something seriously, when to laugh at it, or when to be angry. And I feel like if somebody has like a good example of like, well, this really got him angry, and it's not so much that person should get angry at it too, but I want people to feel okay that they're angry about something, like within reason. You could be angry about certain things, and you could express that anger not necessarily in violent ways or anything like that, but you can definitely have strong messaging. You can definitely let people know that you're not fucking around, kind of thing. Sorry, I didn't even check with you. Is it okay to curse?
Oh, absolutely. No fucking way. Yeah, it's cool.
No fucking way on this channel.
Yeah. I'm gonna pour my drink because this is already getting good. So we are drinking Kraken cream, you call it, right? Is that what it's called?
Well,
Kraken
yes. Kraken cream soda is what I call it, because it tastes, me being a diabetic, I haven't had cream soda in the longest time. So this is the closest that I've tasted like cream soda that hasn't been like, sugar-free cream soda.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the sugar-free. And I'm one of those weird people who I actually prefer the sugar-free versus the regular. So that's I'm just weird like that. But I wanted to ask you, you set the tone, all right? Every guest sets the tone. How many shots am I putting in this bad boy? Just 1, 2? Like,
well, so how big is the cup that you're putting it in? That big?
Like a pint.
I would do between 1 or 2. I think between 1 or 2 shots is probably going to get you good.
Oh. And keep in mind, it is midday in Australia. I'll do 2. This show is like horrible for any type of dieting.
Yeah.
Because I'm cutting down my booze intake, and then it's like, I'm like, oh god, I gotta drink this weekend, and then it's impossible not to like eat junk food after you've been drinking. So awesome. Well, I did actually want to ask you. You mentioned, I think everyone goes through those atheist. I like to call it the atheist edgelord days, where you're like, where you're like, religion, lol, and like you just rip on it the whole time. I've softened a lot in my approach as well. I used to be a Pentecostal youth pastor. I was quite religious at one stage, and I was quite angry as well. But you mentioned about how like you find people you kind of want to emulate, and like when they know when to laugh, when they know when to get angry, when they know how to to take things seriously. Who are they? Like for me, I've got a picture of who I call Daddy Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, on the wall, because I don't agree with him. I don't agree with a lot of what he said, but I just fucking love his wit. Like and he's a brilliant writer in some of the things he said. So for me, I've always loved Christopher Hitchens. Do you have anyone that you looked up to when you first started deconstructing your faith?
Yeah, I mean, I guess kind of the how's that drink?
Oh, it's actually really good.
Yeah, I know, right?
Really good. Oh wow, yeah.
I've tried it with other rums, and other rums don't taste like Kraken and Sprite do.
Yeah.
But so as far as my role, like when I first came out, came into my worldview of atheism, I mean, I guess I looked up to the classic Four Horsemen, I guess you could say, of you get maybe a lot less of Dennett, because he was more philosophy, and at that time I was just like, I'm not really trying to get my head around like all the deep philosophy that Dennett kind of goes into, but he was still important. And then you've got Hitchens and Harris and Krauss was in a Four Horsemen. I believe it was the other. I think the other horseman might have been Dawkins. Maybe? I'm not sure.
Dawkins, yeah, it was Dawkins. Yeah.
So I mean, there were those people, and I can't recall any person in general that I saw like in debates or anything like that would just laugh like at certain claims or things. Maybe Hitchens a little bit, and probably Stephen Fry. There's actually a really good debate with Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Fry against the Catholic Church.
Oh yeah,
and I love that one, and that was a really good debate. And
I'll put a link in the description. Everyone's got to watch it. It's great. It's so good.
Yeah, it's really good.
What I love about that one is he uses the a slur, like for homosexual slur. He uses the F slur, and it takes you off guard really hard. But he's using it in the context of like, this is what the Catholic Church is essentially saying. He's like, he's exposing, and I still feel really uncomfortable when I hear him say it, but at the same time, it brings to light the gravity of what the Catholic Church was doing to a massive amount of people. And I was like, well, it's like, if there's any time, I'm not saying I do endorse using that slur, but if there's any time to endorse using that slur, I think that's probably the only time I could ever be swayed on that opinion. But geez, it was brutal. And also, I love in that conversation where you can see Christopher Hitchens is engaging in a little bit of bad faith, because the Catholic, I'm not saying this in a negative way, he's kind of poking the bear, right? Like when the lady gets up to like make some comments, she corrects him on a few things, and he goes like, yeah, I guess so. Like, but he was driving his point home so hard, and I like the fact that he can be, honest like that. I just thought, I don't know, I love it. I agree with you 100%.
Yeah.
On that one.
Well, and I guess that most of the interactions that I had where I was laughing at certain things just came from a lot of like the YouTube community, watching YouTube content creators. I mean, early in those days, like the Amazing Atheist, he was pretty big on YouTube, but I mean, you had other people like Jacqueline Glenn, she was doing a lot of content,
she's great.
and there wasn't I didn't really see a lot of debates happening when I first was like sort of finding my way around, but I just kind of found my own footing as far as like when I felt like it was okay to laugh at a particular claim. And, there at first, I think that I probably didn't laugh too much. And it's only now in my, I guess, older age where I've heard the same shit, day in and day out every single day. And at some point you gotta start laughing at the ridiculous claims, because there'd be a time where I was like, well, I really don't know how to respond to this. How do I respond to it? So I'll go looking for either information or videos or debates or something like that that would try to answer that question. Like with the morality question, I went searching for that. I found Sam Harris's Moral Landscape, which that's a pretty good book. I mean, in my opinion, Sam Harris has kind of gone off the rails somewhat lately, but
yeah, they all seem to have, haven't they? The four horsemen. They've all got their own little ticks, I guess. I don't know about Dennett, but I definitely know Dawkins, and people have got beef with Dawkins and Harris at the moment, but they've got some good stuff still. But just
like the Sam Harris's Moral Landscape, I think, provides a pretty good examination of, like, if we were to consider morality to be objective, what would we base that in if it's not like religion? And so he goes down that path of it, and so that gives you a really good foundation for looking at how even on objective morality, you have all this subjectivity that underlies it. And so there was all that, and then a big topic is, of course, Christian nationalism, and there's been several debates on that. Sadly, a lot of the debates concern David Silverman, which has turned out to be kind of a shit show. He has, but looking at all that, looking at creators of the same kind of caliber are kind of what I guess crafted how I engage with the opposition, as well as with fellow atheists out there. So I've really tried to take on the role of trying to be somebody that people feel like they can go out and have a drink with, which I mean I've done on a few occasions. People is like, we gotta have a beer.
So do I.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what this show is. Yeah. I actually wanted to just mention too, I've recently read The Fundamentals of Ethics, or listened to the Audible version, by Russ Schaefer Launder. And it just more cemented my perspective that morality just seems to be like, because he goes through every essentially moral theory, utilitarianism, Kant, theories by Kant, Immanuel Kant, I think, just like a lot of different, maybe I got that wrong, but a lot of different theories of ethics. And he just basically he talks about what they are, then brings up like the pros, the cons, what objections that people have, and then he moves on to the next one. And you're like, there seems to be no one real answer. So when people like rip on, because a lot of people will pull apart Sam Harris's book, because he's like kind of like, he begs the question where he goes, well, if we make morality objective and we use it based on well-being, we can make it objective this way. People will say, well, you're kind of just begging the question in regards to what morality is. But I think that Sam Harris may be right there, in that I don't think I'm kind of a moral anti-realist. So I don't think there is such a thing. I don't think there's anything in nature you can point to and say there is morality here. But I think that if you were to build a moral framework, I think Sam Harris, the techniques Sam Harris lays out in the Moral Landscape are actually quite fantastic.
Well, so for them to say that it's begging the question, if you wanted to say that, I think that in order to discuss morality in general, you have to start from an agreement as to what is your end goal. So for like religious people, Christians in particular, their end goal is to follow what God says in their holy book, right? Like it's literally in the Bible that anything that's sinful is basically stuff that doesn't glorify God, or that God says is bad, right? And then everything that's good are the commandments and directions by God, right? So as long as the end goal there would be to follow what God says is good and bad and everything. So that's their end goal. Whereas like for me, the well-being of conscious creatures or whatever that Sam Harris has in his book would be kind of similar to my end goal of, trying to be a good person and, not do harm to others, and try to make sure that the things that I do only help better my community, help better my position and the position of others around me and everything like that. So you have to have like an end goal in mind in order to make those kind of moral justifications about things. Like to say one thing is good or bad, it's like it's good or bad with respect to what you have to have that end goal in mind. So it's just that I don't have the same end goal as religious people, and for some reason that's a problem for them.
Well, it's interesting too, because when I have conversations with religious people and they say, where do you get your morality from or whatever, and like, it's so easy to just see that they also don't get their morality from the Bible, because as soon as you start bringing up segments in the Bible that they would disagree with, like slavery, taking the virgin woman for yourself, killing the infants of the Amalekites, whatever, they start making excuses. Oh, that was for a time, or well, you were taking that out of context. What are you using? What's inside you that's stopping you from accepting those verses as plain reading? Like something is inside you that you're going, maybe it isn't a good idea to own other people as slavery. Maybe it isn't a good idea to stone your unruly child at the corner of the town, like at the gates of the town. Like they make these statements that they follow the Bible as objective morality. You point out what the Bible says, and then they use something else inside them to determine like whether or not they agree with it or not, and then they start making excuses. It's like you're not even objective. Like you say you are, but you're not.
Well, one of the most uncomfortable situations I've been in has been on a debate with Dr. Josh and I, and it was me and Dr. Josh arguing against a couple of black Christians about slavery in the Bible.
I think I remember that one.
Yeah, and a question came. It was like a super chat or something like that, and the host had to read it and ask them this question, and it was basically asking the two black guys, would you be Godless Engineer's slave if it was biblical slavery? And like they said yes. Like both of them were like, yeah, I'd be a slave. And I'm like, I'm way too fucking Southern for this. Can we just not?
Bad optics. Bad optics.
Yeah,
you can't push back. You can't push back. Like, so I could beat you. I could beat you if you didn't know. Like I can draw it all through you, like because it literally looks so bad. Godless Engineer wants to own black people as slaves. Like,
I had to sit there and just be like, listen, I do not condone this. Like, I do not want to own anybody as slaves. Like, I'm way too Alabama for this question. Okay.
I think that's the only way you can. If you want to be consistent with like, I believe everything in the Bible, I think you have to bite the bullet and go, yep, you know what, slavery's okay. Like, so I think that's just what they were doing.
Well, and the biblical or the slavery apologetics is kind of in full force right now. For some reason, the apologists, they just want to deny that there was chattel slavery in the Bible, or that God condoned chattel slavery, and they tie themselves up in knots all the time trying to excuse, like with saying, oh well, that was for a different time, for a different place. And I'm like, well, I'm not saying that you should own slaves now. I'm saying that God thinks it's okay to own slaves because he directly says it.
Yeah, I like to ask them, like, so is owning someone as property a sin? And then they can't say yes, because like it was never changed in the Bible anywhere. Jesus said, I think it was Jesus said, or either Paul or Jesus in the New Testament, obey your masters, even the cruel ones. Slaves, obey your masters, even the cruel ones. So anyway, I actually wanted to quickly touch on, before jumping into some mythicism stuff, I wanted to quickly touch on your journey. So you grew up a Christian.
Yes.
What type of Christian were you?
Well, for starting out, I was Catholic. I went to a private Catholic school up until about 4th grade. And then when I started 5th grade, I wanted to get the fuck out of that place. So I went to public school. And so after that, I kind of bounced around like Southern Baptist and non-denominational churches, and I would go in and out of being very religious. There was at one point in my life, like I had 3 friends in the neighborhood, all of them super religious, right? Like they were doing Bible studies, and they were going to Wednesday night and Sunday morning church, and which Wednesday night was the youth group, and then Sunday would be the regular church services. I almost never went to the Sunday church services because I just felt so out of place. I was the only one that was going and everything, so I felt out of place. But I was fine going to the Wednesday night services where, I mean, we'd sing and then there'd be some Bible teaching where they cherry pick out of the Bible, and then we'd sing some more, and then we'd have dinner and go home. So I mean that was pretty fun. If I wanted to have friends in my area, I had to be religious in some kind of respect. So naturally that kind of peer pressure, I would get like really deep into faith. At one point, I was pretty deep into like wanting to believe in Jesus or wanting to be a good Christian kid. That like I was going to these Christian rock band concerts, and I had bought this necklace that was 3 nails that were put in the shape of a cross. And so I had that necklace. And have you ever heard of the band DC Talk?
Yeah.
They had a persecution porn book put out where it was just a collection of like Christians that had been persecuted for believing, in Jesus.
Not Jesus Freaks, is it?
May have been.
It's like martyrs and stuff.
Yes, it was martyrs. It was like a whole bunch of stories. Yeah. And so like I had bought that and I had read it and it was like all emotional and stuff. And it wasn't until I was with my first, well, she wasn't my wife at that point, but my first wife, my ex-wife. And she kind of challenged me a little bit on it. I had never been the type of person to judge somebody just because they believe differently than me. And maybe that's just because I wasn't all that into like, believing in the religious aspect of it. Like I had been taught just as a fact of reality that God exists, Jesus is his son, and you got to suck his dick in order to get into heaven. And so
okay.
So
I've never heard it said like that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a weird form of Christianity. I've never been.
Well, I mean, obviously, as like a 16-year-old kid, I wasn't thinking that way. But in retrospect, that's kind of what it was. But so I'd never been one to really judge other people for not believing like I did. So like in high school, I remember having a girlfriend that was like Wiccan. And, I kind of rolled my eyes whenever she did some like weird Wicca stuff, but I never judged her for it. And I mean, I think I get that from my dad because my parents were like my mom and my stepfather, they were pretty bad as far as like judging other people and all this other stuff. Plus it being the South, there was all this like inherent racism that was just running rampant all over the place that I didn't even realize until like I stepped out of that bubble. And I realized like how bad it was. But so with my ex-wife, she didn't believe, she wasn't a believer. And so she kind of challenged me on a few things, and I had to really sit there and contemplate like what I believed. And she never like pushed anything on me or anything like that. But it did get to the point where, I was really struggling with it. And I confided in one of my friends. I used to play in a softball church league, right? And I confided in him about it. And one night after a softball practice, he said to me, if you don't believe in the Bible from cover to cover, that it's all literally true, then you're not a real Christian. And so that's like one of the biggest things that I remember in my past. And because it was that night that I was like, well, I guess I'm not a real Christian. I mean, obviously now I know that's like a no true Scotsman fallacy, that it really shouldn't have convinced me away from my position. But, it kind of did, because I was sitting there like, well, what do I believe? Do I believe in a God? Like, do I think that there could be something out there that exists? And so I really had to do a lot of introspection into what I believed, why I believed it. And, I spent a lot of time like looking at the hard questions of like, morality, what evidence we have of God, evidence for Jesus and all this other stuff. Went looking through all of that, and I came out the other end of it, like probably after about 6 months, six to 9 months of really kind of going back and forth, I had to admit to myself that I didn't believe in God anymore. And that was probably the hardest thing that I did, was admitting that I'm an atheist, because, I'd been brought up thinking that you had to believe in God in order to be a good person. Like, you had to do what the Bible tells you, or you have to, basically, what would Jesus do? If you're not doing what you think Jesus would do, then you're probably going to hell. And, I had that racking around my brain for like a good portion of my life. And so to actually admit to myself that I didn't believe anymore, that was a really big hurdle for me to get over. So, I eventually got over it, and I was fine with it. I accepted it. And then that's when problems started with like family members and everything. Like I remember, of course, this was early. So, cringy atheists kind of saying inflammatory things.
Yeah.
I said a few things that upset some family members, and they ended up unfriending me on Facebook and all this other stuff. And so that's when I created Godless Engineer. It was an outlet so that I could, speak my mind about things and reply and have my voice heard, and not have to worry about my family getting pissed off at me.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had a similar experience when you had that moment of no true Scotsman fallacy, but you had that moment where you're like, well, am I a Christian if I don't believe the whole Bible? And they got you thinking, because I had a moment like that when I was talking to a lady at the church, and I was reading the Bible through again, or the New Testament, and I said, I got up to the scripture in 2 Timothy. I'll just read it. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one who was deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, and propriety. And I mentioned this to her, and she said, oh, well, that was for a time. And that was big. And she explained the whole, apologetics. There were, men and women were separated. She'd lean over the aisle. She'd interrupt because she didn't understand, because they weren't educated back then. But that's not now. It's not for the time, right? And I was like, well, no, it says it. It says the reason. It says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived. Women were deceived. So that's still true today. And then it says but women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, holiness, and propriety. And I was like, those reasons are still there. Like, it's still, and I don't agree with that. And I was like, I think women should be. I'm all for equality. Like, I think women should be able to. And I just saw that what she was saying, and at the same time, she would say that, homosexuality is a sin. And one of my dear friends who I went through Bible college, ministry college with, he was closeted for 45 years, and he recently came out. And I'm looking, I'm like, man, his whole life has kind of been screwed because he thinks that homosexuality is a sin. They're not saying that was for a time. They're saying, no, that's still relevant today. But then there's a verse clearly here, and they're saying, no, that's for a time. And that was for me. I went away going, okay, I need to think about this, because I obviously disagree with the Bible. I need to fix myself. Like, I need to work out why I disagree with the Bible and go. And for me, that was like a little like, why do I disagree with the Bible? Like, is something wrong with me? Like, and it was interesting. That's it. That happened for me as well, like that. Sorry, go.
Oh, well, I was just getting, because I remember you saying that you were Pentecostal, right? A Pentecostal preacher. Were you the crazy snake handler kind of Pentecostal?
No, we don't have that.
Okay.
That's like an American phenomenon, I'm pretty sure.
Sadly, I can totally see that.
We have like we were like Hillsong kind of churches. We went to Hillsong conference. We did speaking in tongues. We did laying on of hands. I remember coming off stage once after preaching, and it was always good when you preached about the power of God and preached about what happened in the Bible and Acts. And I was a youth pastor. I ran up to one of the youth he was only a year younger than me. So he was like a leader, and it was an altar call. And I went up to him and I grabbed, like, he was like laying his hands up like this, like in the worship moment. And I grabbed him, like I touched his face like this to pray for him, which is what I felt the Spirit led me to do. And he flew backwards. Like, he's like, and passed out. And just like people grabbed him and he just on the ground. And so it was like, I got the power. But it was really, there was a lot of like really weird experiences like that. Or there was, moments of like people having like what looked like seizures for hours. and we
Mhm.
would just like laugh at them and like carry them to the next prayer room and pray for them. Like it was bizarre stuff.
Yeah, so as a kid, I was always pretty introverted, and so I remember going to this one church here, and like they asked the crowd, because it was like a youth service. They asked the crowd, like, if there's anybody struggling with anything, raise your hands. And so I was like, yeah, I struggle with shit. And so they're like, why don't y'all come on up here and pray for Jesus, to help you out or something. And I didn't want to go up there. Like I was a little embarrassed, for one, but I was also very introverted. And so like they noticed that I raised my hand but I didn't come up, and so they're like, why didn't you go up there? And I'm like, I just didn't want to. And so they called in reinforcements. And so imagine me, a teenager, and then there's like 8 people surrounding me, putting their hands on me, praying, and I'm sitting there like, okay,
Yeah,
this
you made it
doesn't this
worse by
doesn't
not going to the
actually.
front.
Yeah, I know, I did. Like
Yeah.
I didn't go up to the front for a reason, guys. There's no reason to form this little circle around me right now.
Yeah.
Not possessed.
Yeah. No, that's they did that. So I used to do the altar calls where, you'd go raise your hand, and then they'd raise their hand, like everyone close, and then come at the front. But I found a technique that worked even better, and that is to get people at the front. Because my job as a preacher was to get people to walk to the end of the diving board and to jump off into the Holy Spirit. That's what we believe. That's what we taught. So I would say to them, okay, everyone to close their eyes, raise their hand, and I was like, okay, and pray to God, blah blah blah. And then I was like, God wants you to know that He loves you. And then I was like, if you feel that you need prayer for something, I want you to raise your hand. And then a few scattered hands would go up, and then you'd say, okay, if you feel like your heart beating faster, that's God calling you. God's calling you. So you start reaffirming their feelings, and then you go, I'm going to count to 3. And I want everyone to raise their hands. And I'd say, 1, God loves you. He's there for you. He cares for you. Blah, 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 blah. 2, God's pulling on your heart. He's calling you. The angels of heaven are blah, 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 blah. I'm even getting goosebumps now just thinking about it. 2, and then I go, and 3, raise your hands, and boom, all these hands would go up, and they'll be like, okay, everyone's raised your hands. I want you to come up the front. There's so many of you, so I'm reaffirming. There's so many of you who raised your hands. You're not going to be alone. Come up the front. And that act of people getting up out of their seats, taking a step out in front of a crowd of a couple hundred people, is such a euphoric feeling of like adrenaline, and it's scary, and but you feel safe, and it's if there was no such thing as, I can see how, if the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster did something similar, I could see how people would have similar reactions to that if they truly believed it.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting to kind of deconstruct all that. Did you have when you left your faith, did you have like a strong, like did you find it quite hard emotionally, or did you?
I mean, it wasn't all that hard emotionally for me, like leaving the faith. But I mean, I think that the reason for that is that I wasn't all that emotionally tied to my faith. Like, I had grown up believing, as a fact of reality. I guess the best way that I could compare it is like, if you grew up believing that, let's say that, all cars are red, and then you figure out, well, I don't believe that all cars are red. There are some blue cars out there or something like that. And it's just, oh, I totally accept that there are blue cars now. And so I wasn't really emotionally tied, to believing in God, despite the fact that I would go in and out, of having these bouts of deep belief where I definitely was emotionally tied to it. But I think that was more about like my clinical depression, rather than actually being like emotionally tied to it. And so I at the point where I was questioning things, I definitely was not all that emotionally tied to it. So it really didn't affect me emotionally.
Wow. Okay, that's interesting. So you start this YouTube channel as an outlet for your newfound beliefs. When do you become a Jesus mythicist?
Oh, it wouldn't be for maybe a few years, afterwards. Well, it was a few years after I became an atheist that I started doubting, whether or not Jesus existed. And then I would say that I shored up my personal view of it, maybe a year or so after, I started kind of looking at all of the literature about it. And the way that happened was that, you know, uh, I was Facebook was where it was at, like 2013, 2014 kind of atheism. At least the where I was most active at was Facebook, right? And so what I would do is I'd go into these Facebook groups and I've had these discussions. I'd discuss, what I thought about, different aspects of arguments against uh, God existing or Jesus. And so it got to this one point where they were talking about, like evidence for Jesus. And I'm like, surely there's historical evidence for Jesus. I mean, we've got, if that, he surely existed. So there's got to be some kind of evidence that points to his existence. And I had somebody challenge me on that, like, well, why don't you provide me the evidence? And so I went looking for it. And I mean, like, I found the Pilot Stone, but I was, of course, that doesn't prove that Jesus existed. That just proves that Pilate existed, and that says nothing about whether or not Jesus existed. And so I went looking around for different pieces of evidence, and I really didn't find any good pieces of evidence. But what I did stumble upon was David Fitzgerald's 10 Christian Lies, it was nailed 10 Christian Lies. So I stumbled upon that book and I read it. I think I eventually listened to the audiobook too. And I listened to David Fitzgerald talk about it. And then that kind of led me down the path of like, well, who are these other people that are saying this? And that led me to Richard Carrier, Randall Helms. I don't think Randall Helms is a mythicist, but he's got great books analyzing like the New Testament and where all of the stories and everything like that for Jesus come from. And which is the Old Testament scriptures, and so it just kind of led me down this path of I guess sort of taking a different look at the historicity of Jesus. And I came away like analyzing the evidence, looking at both sides, the arguments that the historicists put forth and the arguments that mythicists put forth. And I found that the mythicist arguments seem to make a lot more sense given the evidence that we have than the historicist argument. I felt the historicist arguments were a lot more strained and they had to make more speculative statements, more ad hoc reasoning and stuff like that. So, I just had to sit there again, another point in my life where I was just like, well, I guess I just don't believe that Jesus, existed in the first place. That's kind of how I came into that position. I can't remember when the first piece of content that I started making on that was. It was probably around 2014 or 2015 time frame there. But I started making content on it. Just kind of kept going with it. As far as like researching into it and really diving into the nitty gritty details of the actual arguments for and against.
Well, I think your first problem was you needed to look for Jesus in your heart because that's where Jesus.
Shit. Obviously, he's
that's
in
where
my
the historical
heart.
Jesus is. So a lot of people, I was at a staff party the other week, and they go, "Oh, who are you interviewing next?" And I said, and none of these people are super religious. Well, a couple guys are, but and I go, "Oh, I'm interviewing a Jesus Mythicist," and they said, "What's that?" And I said, and I was trying to explain it to them, and they're looking at me like, "That's interesting. That's an interesting idea," and like they've never heard it before. So I was wondering if you could give us like a brief introduction to what mythicism is, because you mentioned too there's the cringy derp type of mythicist, and then there's the scholarly type of mythicist. So I was wondering if you give us a brief introduction of what the type of mythicism you believe in or you subscribe to, sorry, I should say.
Right. Yeah. So for me, the kind of mythicism that I subscribe to is called minimal mythicism, or typically called the minimal mythicist hypothesis. And that's basically like, what's the minimal case that would be needed in order for all of the evidence to make sense if Jesus didn't exist in history. And basically, what that position is that, of course, the Gospels are all fictional accounts of this celestial being known as Jesus. And Paul, he believed in a celestial version of Jesus. That was the only kind of Jesus that he knew. And this celestial Jesus is actually an archangel in Jewish ideology, that it is meant to redeem the Jewish people for their sins and all that, and basically allow them to allow them to get into paradise or get into heaven, absolve them of all their sins, so that they're not like suffering or whatnot anymore. And so that's pretty much a good description of it. It's it's typically based in actual evidence that we have, whether that be Paul's epistles, other writings that we have from the time, and an acknowledgement that there are writings that we no longer have, but we do have indications of them existing in physical documents, like empirical evidence that we have that they definitely did exist. And so putting all of that together and kind of, acknowledging that New Testament studies right now is a bit broken, in that you have primarily Christians that are investigating this historical question. You're going to have a lot of religious bias that comes into play here. And I've actually been analyzing like scholars that are commonly brought up and suggested, and all of them seem to be theologically committed for one reason or another to their faith. So it's kind of hard to expect good arguments and evidence out of them. But as far as minimal mythicism goes, it's, there's a celestial Jesus. Paul had visions of this celestial Jesus. Other people as well, not just Paul, but other people as well had celestial visions of this Jesus that supposedly absolved the sins through his death and resurrection. And then later people built historical stories upon this celestial Jesus, making him into a historical figure. And that's what we have today.
So you would so I just want to touch on a few of those things just so I better understand. So do you subscribe to the standard dates for the epistles and the gospels? So I think the epistles, when were the epistles written? 20 years after Jesus?
Yeah, so it's between, I believe it's between 55 and like 65 or something like that the epistles were written, at least the authentic ones.
So traditionally, the non-mythicist position is Jesus was crucified in 30 to 33 AD, right? CE.
Depending on which gospel you read, yeah.
Yes, yeah, CE, yeah. So then you've got, and then you've got the epistles, which were written first, which were written 25 years later. Is that right? Something like that. Then you have Mark, which was written 30 to 40 years after the fact, I think.
Yep.
And then Matthew and Luke were written around the same time, and then John was our latest gospel, written 95 CE.
Well, so the only thing that I disagree with is Matthew and Luke being written at the same time. Matthew was written first, and then Luke was written after Matthew. Because there are portions of Matthew, like Matthew's Greek, that appear in Luke's gospel. And so the only way that could happen is that Luke was copying from Matthew.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, so when you say, so what my understanding of mythicists was before we originally spoke, was that Jesus isn't real, lol. Okay, so that's like the idea I had. So when you say celestial being, what does that mean?
Well, so Jewish ideology, and if you go back and or at least maybe think about the Old Testament, celestial beings are all over the place in the Old Testament in Jewish theology, and so the idea is that this celestial Jesus is just another angel. Well, specifically, God's what he considers to be the firstborn son, God's logos. He like this. This isn't just some random celestial being. He's definitely an important celestial being in the pantheon of celestial beings in Judaism. But he's a celestial being that his role is to absolve the Jewish people of their sins, or come back and save them, basically save that remnant that's always being discussed about in the Old Testament.
So something that I found quite interesting when I was reading Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, I think it's called, links in the description for all resources, by the way, is he mentioned something about Isaiah 53, and I think it seems as though he subscribes to that being a reference to Jesus as the Messiah, where I thought that the scholarly consensus at the moment, unless you talk to a fundamentalist, was that the suffering servant was Israel.
Well, so there's a big distinction to make here. Like there's nuance. So the two questions that we need to ask about Isaiah 53: what did the original author mean? Like, what was his intent with it? And then the other question is, what did later Jewish and then eventually Jewish Christians think about that particular section? Okay, so to answer your first question, I think that the scholarly consensus is definitely that the suffering servant is Israel. That's who it was originally meaning. But when you go on later to the first century BCE and onward, you have this sort of a reinterpretation of Isaiah 53 where they're taking it to be an indication of like the Messiah, like this is what the Messiah is supposed to do. And
is that in like Jewish sources that are outside of the Hebrew Bible, or is that within the Hebrew Bible?
Well, no, it's from so as far as Jewish sources go that take on that particular interpretation, you have the Talmud, which admittedly was written hundreds of years afterwards. But the thing is that it seems highly plausible that the Jews would come up with an interpretation of Isaiah 53 that would directly coincide with what the Christians were saying, and not even mention the Christians, or mention Jesus with respect to Isaiah 53. So the Talmud actually has a Messiah like theology contained within it that includes Isaiah 53 as being an indication of what's to happen to the Messiah, because in the Talmud, in Jewish theology, the Messiah is actually two people. You have one Messiah that is to die, right, for the sins of the Israelite people, and then there's another Messiah that comes in, resurrects that first one, and saves the day. And so with Christian theology, all you have to do is merge those two into one, and you have Jesus. And so it's literally like there's a split in different sects of Jews. That one is the more orthodox, I guess, version of Judaism that continues on to today, and then the other split is what eventually turns into Christianity. And so we have evidence in both Judaism and in Christianity that they were interpreting Isaiah 53 by the first century AD to be about the Messiah. So those are the two important questions that you have to ask with Isaiah 53 and sort of make the distinction between the two.
I've heard I think Bart Ehrman and I think in Deborah Grace's book Crucifying the Bible, she mentioned how the Messiah was supposed to be like a king, like an earthly king that like destroyed Israel's enemies and stuff, and that's why Jesus didn't fit that, because obviously he didn't. And the Christians have reinterpreted to be like demons and he saved the world through their sins or something, rather than what it was originally. What do you think about that?
Well, so we definitely have like real evidence of the Jews interpreting the Messiah to be that way, because we have preserved in Josephus, we've got several different failed messiahs that were trying to be those conqueror messiahs. And the big difference is that whereas these physical conquering messiahs all failed, Jesus is the only Messiah that supposedly, through his death, even though he also died, which not all of the Messiahs like that Josephus records died. Like the Egyptian is one that doesn't, I don't think that he's recorded as dying. He just sort of abandons, his whole campaign. But you have Jesus through his death is completing this promise that God had made in the Old Testament. And the thing that you got to keep in mind here is that the beliefs of the Jewish people were not monolithic. A lot like Bart Ehrman and other scholars like him will try to focus on this idea that the Jews thought that the Messiah was supposed to be a conqueror. Well, that's somewhat true, because there were Jews that believed that, and that
some Jews,
right, that may have been the mainstream view of the Messiah, but it definitely wasn't like all Jews thought this. And so when you consider that there were different groups out there like the Essenes, who had wildly different ideas than the Orthodox or the mainstream Jewish beliefs, you'll see that it's very likely that there was a group out there that considered the Messiah to be the celestial figure that wasn't supposed to like defeat the Romans or anything like that, but he was supposed to defeat the devil. He was supposed to, because, and that comes from Zoroastrianism, right? They were integrating Zoroastrianism into the Jewish belief, and that's where you get the devil from. And
the devil makes a much bigger appearance in the New Testament, and God's missing. God's not really there.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that's because there's this big syncretism with Judaism and these other surrounding pagan beliefs. And one of those pagan beliefs is Zoroastrianism. And what they get from Zoroastrianism is the burning hellfire place where you go if you're bad. And you have this ultimate enemy of God being the devil. And so when they were syncretizing all these different pagan beliefs, including Zoroastrianism, they ended up with this devil figure. And I mean, the devil figure is not like this physical presence like here on earth. Like it's not the Romans or anything like that. It's this celestial sort of presence that Jesus is supposed to, conquer. And they interpreted their Old Testament scriptures. They reinterpreted their Old Testament scriptures to seem to indicate that this Messiah was to die and overcome death by resurrecting, therefore defeating like the devil in that way. And so there's a lot of reinterpretation, and I just to get back around to it, you have to understand that early Jewish beliefs were not monolithic. They had a diverse set of beliefs, and it's very, very plausible that this was one of them. And there's a lot of different references that we can come up with where, you have these early Christians and Jewish Christians that believed in these, celestial beings, like the fact that the devil resides the devil and his demons reside in the lower part of the heavens, which would be right on top of the firmament. Even Paul himself says that the devil controls the world. He's the prince of the air, or he's the ruler of this era or age, ruler of this world. That's how he describes the devil. So these ideas, while they may seem weird, they wouldn't have seemed weird to first century Jews and Jewish Christians.
Interesting. Yeah, I find that Michael Grinaldo, who I've had on, brilliant philosophizer and history teacher, he said that he said to me, the people of the first century or antiquity were in a different universe than us. Like their references, their thinking, everything was so different. It's almost impossible to just take a layman's perspective and view the stuff that you read and say, oh, that's what they thought, because it's a different universe. It's a completely different universe. It's so different.
Yeah, and so it always amazes me when you have people that say, "Oh, they wouldn't have believed this thing." Like, you have a lot of apologists. I believe even Bart Ehrman is known to say this, that the early Jews and Jewish Christians, they wouldn't have believed in a suffering and dying Messiah. But it's very obvious that they would have, because they did. And the fact that they lived it, like, they had a totally different concept of how this universe was constructed back then, and what was real and what wasn't. And I think once you consider that, and you kind of step outside of this idea that that what makes sense to you is what are the only things that would make sense to these early Jews and Jewish Christians. I think once you step outside of that, you can understand how, oh yeah, definitely they'd believe in ghosts in your blood. I mean, they'd believe in crazy things like that.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm putting another shot down into this glass, pouring some more Sprite, and I'm gonna.
I'm just glad that you like it enough to where you'll have.
Oh, dude, it's actually really delicious, and I'm enjoying this. It's giving me good buzz. I'm gonna. I know that when we spoke for the first time, you mentioned some scriptures. So I want to ask you now. Okay, so let's say I'm someone who's just listened to this podcast, and they just heard the mythicist theory for the first time, or idea, hypothesis. And they're going, okay, where is John getting these ideas? And you mentioned Paul. I thought maybe we could start with Paul. Why do you think Paul is talking about a celestial Jesus?
Well, so for one thing, there's no reference in Paul that unambiguously talks about Jesus as a historical figure. And there are different passages where Paul talks about Jesus being born and all this other stuff, but the problem with that is, and you do have to get a little bit into the Greek, and understand what the Greek words that he used meant. But as far as like,
why would you do that when Jesus wrote in English, and he was the greatest American that had ever lived?
There you go. Mythicism defeated.
Yeah. Why go to the Greek when you can just read it in English?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the Greek interlinear texts are easy to find on the web, and you can even get whole ass books that have the Greek interlinear in it, and you can see what words are used, how those words are used in the Koine Greek, and everything like that. You can also find places where Paul talks about other people being born, where he uses a completely different word for being born that's more explicitly about being born than it is about than the word is that he uses to talk about Jesus's birth. The word that he uses to talk about Jesus's birth is more like he came to be. Like he just sort of manifested in some kind of way, not exactly the way, because like when you talk about somebody being born, you don't say, oh yeah, that guy manifested one day in 1984. You don't talk about him like that. But Paul, when he talks about Jesus's birth, he normally talks about it as if Jesus's body was manufactured in some kind of fashion. So there's that. And then if you look in Galatians 1:11, you'll actually find that Paul separates himself completely from any historical sourcing. He claims that he did not get any of this information about Jesus from man. He only got it from reading the scriptures, and then in other places he gets it from visions. So those are the two places. Huh?
He says, I'm just reading it out. He says, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that the gospel I preach is not of human origin. Right. That's the NIV translation.
Yes. So the gospel being the death and the resurrection and the absolution of sins that that Jesus provides, right? Like the basic theology of Christianity of how Jesus's death absolves sins and everything like that. And that's what he's talking about there. So a lot of people push back on that by saying, well, you think Paul was the first Christian, or you think that Paul didn't hear about Jesus from other people? And obviously I don't think that, because Paul talks about persecuting Christians before him. So obviously he had some kind of interaction with them. But the important part here is that Paul was saying that despite anything that he had heard before, the things that he knows are true about Jesus and his death, his resurrection, his absolution of sins, all of that is due to having visions of Jesus and reading the scriptures and being guided by this celestial form of Jesus. And so that's why I think that Paul only ever mentions a celestial Jesus, is because he's never explicit about getting any kind of information from anybody on earth or referencing anybody on earth about Jesus. So it seems to me like there's more parsimonious explanations for the very few verses that you can pull out about Jesus that Paul mentions. And you can actually make a better case on the idea that he's talking about a celestial version, or at least maybe not a celestial version, but just that he's not talking about a historical reference to Jesus. And so it seems like Paul has completely separated himself from any kind of history that would normally be done.
Okay, so is so the road to Damascus, for those who don't know, it's when Paul had this experience, blinding light. It sounds like a seizure or some sort of we have some medical ideas of what it might have been at the time. But he was on the road he was persecuting Christians, right? He was charging them or doing whatever he was doing, or killing them. I'm not sure exactly what he was doing when he was named Saul. So how do you think the Christian sect started? What was Christianity at that time? Or do you think it was a branch that was getting more and more popular, a branch of Judaism that was getting more popular because of this this idea of like becoming Messiah?
Yes. Well, so what you've got is you've got the Jews being promised by God in the Old Testament, to be saved. That God, like, there's several different references in the Old Testament that you could definitely peg as talking about at least Jesus and what he's supposed to do. Like, God is supposed to save his remnant and all this other stuff. And so you've got this big lead up to it, and then nothing happens. And so what you end up with is, right there, first century BCE and first century AD, you seem to have this revolution in Jewish thought, where they're trying to syncretize Jewish ideas with surrounding pagan and Hellenistic ideas. And we have evidence of this from the Jews themselves in the form of Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria, he talks about his logos, which is described in the exact same ways that Paul describes Jesus. And the logos, under Philo's identification of him, is an archangel in Jewish ideology that is supposed to, provide salvation for the Jewish people. Like, he's the guy that's supposed to do that. And then you have Paul talking about Jesus in the exact same way that Philo's talking about his logos. In the Gospel of John, you even have the author calling Jesus the Logos, talking about how he is the Logos, how he is the Word. Like, what was the first line in John? Something about the Word being with God or whatnot. And so there's this whole idea of in both Paul and in like later gospel, like the Gospel of John, of this Jesus, or this archangel figure, being pre-existent to like everything, being what Philo and both Philo and Paul say, that everything was created through this archangel person, right? With Paul being Jesus and Philo being the Logos, everything was created through them. And so what we have is this revolutionary syncretism with Judaism and other pagan beliefs. And so what we have is just a sort of a gradual development of a certain sect of Judaism that believes that the Messiah has already come, died, resurrected, and absolved sins. And one piece of a good piece of evidence for this is actually a lost gospel that we only know about because of Irenaeus in the 2nd century. Irenaeus talks about this sect that believes that Jesus came, suffered, and died in silence. Like nobody knew that Jesus had come and done any of that. The only indication that they were given was when Jesus revealed himself after his resurrection. And so we've got Irenaeus saying that, and then we've got Paul, earlier in the 1st century, talking about how the celestial being, Jesus, was giving him all of these different visions. Even when he talks about the Lord's Supper, which a lot of people misidentify as the Last Supper, but Paul identifies it as the Lord's Supper. Even then, I forget which, I think it's in one of the Corinthians, but when Paul's describing this Lord's Supper, he says that he received it in the exact same way that he had received everything else, and that would be through a vision of Jesus. And so I think that Jewish Christians, which would be the first Christians, the Jewish Christians were a sect of Jews that developed slowly due to this syncretism with Judaism and surrounding pagan and Hellenistic ideas.
Interesting. So I just went to John, the first John, which is the last gospel, and I'm just going to read out the start of that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then in verse 6 it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. So it's interesting that there's like this delineation between like what it's describing as Jesus there and what it's describing as John, like a man. John's just right. John's a man. It's interesting. I never picked that up until you just mentioned it then, about John. So we've gone through Paul, and we've touched a little bit on the gospel. So what were the gospel writers doing? Were they trying to personify this celestial being in a context? Were they trying to deceive people, or were they kind of writing a story that was like trying to personify this celestial being to be like a real figure, like Hercules or something? What do you think they were doing?
Well, I guess I'll answer this with a question to maybe get you to think. Do you think that the whoever wrote like the Pentateuch, the Old Testament, do you think that they were trying to deceive like the Jews when they wrote about the Garden of Eden, or they wrote about Noah's flood, or anything like that?
That's a very good question, because Dr. Josh got me on a whole other jam with all that stuff. He mentioned how Genesis 1 to 11 is a polemic against Mesopotamia, but it's stories that are fictional, but they serve a purpose as a real story to push back against the Mesopotamian myth. So yeah. I mean, I obviously don't believe there was a global flood. I don't believe in Adam and Eve or anything like that.
Were they
trying to deceive people? Probably not. No.
Yeah. So I don't think that the gospel writers were trying to deceive anybody. What I think that they were trying to do was tell stories about Jesus that were to communicate the tenets of Christianity, and also give this sort of maybe a little bit of a historical air about it. That in telling these stories, it was meant, and even Jesus in Mark, I can't remember the chapter, but in Mark, Jesus explicitly says that these are parables, that only the initiated will understand the meaning of these parables. To the outside world, they'll just seem like stories. And this is kind of like an internal admission right there, that this comes from like John Dominic Crossan. He has this fantastic book called The Power of Parable, where he puts forth that the Gospels themselves are just gigantic parables that are meant to teach lessons to the Christians. And it's very easy to see. And so, like, with the gospel writers, they were trying to show that this Jesus was definitely the Messiah. They were trying to show that he was a prophet of God, and that the things that he would have done here on earth, if there was any kind of like historical mention about him, would have been in line with what was already in the Old Testament, because like nearly all of the miracles in the New Testament have roots in the Old Testament, every single one of them. So it seems like this is a giant explanation as to why Jesus provides the salvation that he does, why Jesus is considered the last prophet of God, and why Jesus is essentially the Messiah. And so I feel like each gospel is told to fit a certain group of Christians, because it's representative of at least 4 different groups of Christians that had different beliefs about Jesus and what he did. Supposedly with his maybe not necessarily historically, because we even have like Origen and other early church fathers that admit that these stories about Jesus are the exact same as other pagan gods that exist. They call them the sons of Zeus, I believe. And so you have them admitting that, yeah, this Jesus is the exact same, but he's better. And he's better because he's Jewish. And so just like you were saying with the first bit of Genesis being a pushback against, these other cultures, I think that the Gospels are a pushback against these other pagan religions, all the other religions out there that, puts Jesus in this very elevated position of being better than all these other ones because he was Jewish. And and so it was just a way of spreading the religion and showing that they are far better than the other religions that are out there.
Interesting. I one of the biggest points against Christianity, in my opinion, and this would work for mythicism as well, is that we do have historians at the time, right, writing at the time of Jesus's life. Is that true? I know we have Josephus. He was after the fact, but we do have writings of.
Well, so Paul, and I know this is where I push back with a lot of mythicists, in that, a lot of mythicists will say, well, you can't use the Bible to justify the Bible, but, you have to take into consideration that the Bible is a collection of books, like it's a collection of writings. And so Paul is in the Bible, but he is our earliest indication of a Jesus figure, right? So he's our earliest one that's writing at the time. And then as far as secular historians go, I believe that Josephus comes right after that. And then everything else occurs in the 2nd century and onward. So we don't have much as far as like 1st century goes, but I don't think that other than Christians themselves, there's no secular historian that really mentions Jesus in the 1st century, with the caveat of Josephus that maybe we'll go into here in a minute.
But there were historians, right? Like there were people writing stuff down.
Oh, yes. Well, as far as people writing stuff down that typically historians now would look to in order to know certain things about history, there were definitely a lot of people that were writing at that time that should have noted something about Jesus, that had reasons to mention Jesus unambiguously.
Yeah.
But we don't actually have like any all of those authors seem to not reference any kind of Jesus that we know.
because the biggest thing for me is, Matthew talks about when Jesus died. At the moment the curtains of the temple were torn in two from top to bottom, the earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life and came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the city and appeared to many people. So
Yeah.
technically they're not zombies, because zombies have to be brought up by black magic, I think, but they sound an awful lot like zombies and they appeared to many people, and no historian wrote these down. Like, to me,
Right.
this is a lot more. I mean, they were writing like trivial things at the time, like, who owed someone money or whatever, like just random stuff.
Well, yeah. So there is one particular argument where people try to suggest that that's a real historical event, at least the eclipse and the earthquake, and that's through Thales and Phlegon, I believe, are the two sources. But the problem is with those particular sources, they're not extant to us now, and it's actually like a third-hand reporting of it, because actually somebody reciting Julius Africanus who was reciting those guys. But in any case, the actual sources don't put the earthquake as happening anywhere near the time in which it would have. Plus, we don't have any empirical evidence, like in the geology, that there was an earthquake at that time. But I believe it's Thales that mentions an eclipse. But even within that source itself, it talks about how this doesn't make sense because there would not have been an eclipse at this time. And they never tie the eclipse to happening at a specific point in history. They just sort of ambiguously talk about an eclipse. So there's no real good evidence that any of that happened. But I do want to mention that a little bit of a fun fact here. Did you know that Mike Licona lost 2 jobs and speaking engagements because he said that was just apocalyptic imagery? He wasn't even denying that it isn't real. Like, he was just like, oh, that's apocalyptic imagery, and they're like, fired, fucker.
There's a few Christians that Christian, like, scholars and or preachers that I have some respect for. And I think Mike Licona engages with things kind of like, you have to compare them to what they're up against, right? Like, when you've got Kent Hovind on one side and you got Mike Licona on the other side, like, I'm going for Mike each time. He's just he's got some, he's got a lot more reasonable than a lot. So in regards to mythicism, I have a lot of questions from my Discord, and I was wondering if we could jump through some of those now.
Oh, sure.
Because it talks about, like, some of the things we mentioned, like Josephus and things like that. And if this kind of blends into some more talking points, that's totally fine as well. So do you think? So this is from one of my Discord mods, Jacob. Do you think historians Tacitus and Josephus, due to their positive views towards Christ or negative views towards Nero, displayed bias in their records of Jesus's existence?
Well, so for me, like, those particular references, you don't really even have to get into, like, their biases or anything like that. So taking each of those one at a time, with Tacitus, I think that, I could take Tacitus at face value. Like, yeah, sure, he's talking about Christ or whatnot, but the only thing that tells us is that there were Christians in Rome in 64 CE. And so I don't see how that should affect mythicism in any kind of way. It does talk about stuff that you find in the New Testament, but the problem with that is that Tacitus was actually in conversation. He was like a pen pal with Pliny the Younger, who was busy interrogating Christians in the next the next country over or whatnot. So he could have easily gotten that information from Pliny the Younger in his correspondence with him. So the best that Tacitus gives us, and I'm not, and this isn't just me pulling this out of my ass. I'm actually getting this from Robert Van Voorst, who's a Christian New Testament scholar. There's no way to know where Tacitus is getting this information, so there's no way that we can say that it's independent of the New Testament. Considering that Tacitus was writing in the 2nd century, he probably had 3, if not all 4, of the major Gospels available to him. So he, in one way or another, either directly or indirectly through Pliny, he could have gotten that information in some kind of way. So without a way to distinguish what his sources were for that information, there's no way that we can use that as like direct evidence that Jesus existed. And then with Josephus, obviously, I'm in the camp that thinks that both of the instances in Josephus are interpolated. I think that the Testimonium Flavianum, the big ad for Jesus in Book 18, is a malicious interpolation, either by Eusebius or Eusebius's mentor, either one, but it doesn't show up in the history record until Eusebius mentions it. So it had to be inserted at some point right there. And there's been multiple scholars that have noticed that the structure of it is different than Josephus and the way that Josephus writes about everything else. So there's a lot of, I've got a whole like clipped video on my Clips channel where I kind of go through extensively all of the arguments against it. But
Okay.
so
I'll link that. I'll link that in the description. So just for my audience sakes, and also a bit of my sake, so Josephus is a 1st century historian who was born around the time the traditional view of Jesus died. So he was born around 30 CE or something. Oh, geez, I could be getting it wrong. Let's forget about that. Forget about that. Blank that. Cut that. He was a 1st century historian, right? A secular historian. And a lot of people mention that Josephus, a lot of people say that Josephus, he was a Jew, but he mentioned Jesus as the Messiah, which a Jew would never do. Because then he wouldn't be a Jew. So he'd be a Christian. So is that the only arguments for those scriptures, those parts of his history books? This is catching up with me. The rum's catching up with me. So are that the only sections that are not like? Is that the only reason we don't classify them as like? We classify them as being injected into the scripts after the fact?
Oh no, that's not the only reason. In fact, the most popular apologetic for the Testimonium Flavianum is that it's partially interpolated. So basically, you take out all of the really Christian parts and you replace them with non-Christian sort of references, and that's probably what Josephus wrote. But the problem with that is that we don't have any evidence that actually existed at any point in history. And so but the reason why we know this is that, there's some people that say that there's a Syriac and Arabic version of it that have that has the original, that preserves the original. But Alice Wheely has actually shown that both of those versions are ultimately copied from Eusebius's version. So those are actually later redactions. So the only version that we know of is the one with the very highly Christianized verses in it. But that still isn't what convinces people that it was interpolated or inserted into Josephus's work. Stuff like verb usage, the structure of the passage, the fact that you can, the passage is awkwardly worked into that particular section. So like if you remove that section, the passages around it seem to flow into one another seamlessly. And that's one of the indications that you can generally use to determine if a passage was interpolated into a piece of work. Because if it is, then all the stuff around it should flow together fine, like it was never there. And that's exactly what you see in Josephus. That's of course not a nail in the coffin or anything like that. What I would consider to be the nail in the coffin is the fact that the structure of that particular passage follows along with the Emmaus Road story in Luke pretty well. The fact that the grammar and structure of it in general is different from Josephus's surrounding work is a pretty big nail in the coffin for me. The fact that nobody mentions Josephus writing about this, even when Origen was specifically looking for references to Jesus. Him not mentioning Josephus talking about Jesus in this light, even if it's not the highly Christianized version of it, it's a more Jewish version of it. The fact that Origen complains about Josephus not mentioning Jesus is kind of a big nail for me. So there's a lot of different reasons to consider it to be interpolated, and like I said, that video that I'm going to get to David to put in the description has like several different reasons, along with the scholars that have put them out there and references to where you can go and look up the stuff for yourself. That'll be in that video.
Awesome. First of all, I want everyone to go subscribe to Godless Engineer. He just pumps out content after content after content on all this stuff. A lot of it goes over my head, but maybe it doesn't go over your head. So go subscribe to Godless Engineer. But my understanding that the first that we don't have the original copy of Josephus's work,
right? I think the copy that's extant to us now comes from like the 10th century or something like that.
The 10th century,
I think. Yeah.
Whoa, that's okay. I thought maybe it was like that's okay. That's quite late. Okay. Wow, I didn't know that. Next question. What would convince you that the Bible is accurate?
Oh, let's see. What would convince me that the Bible's accurate? At this point,
I guess this isn't necessarily a mythicist question. This is more of just broadly.
Right. I mean, I really don't. I mean, you would have to upend all of history in order to make the Bible fit in history. So unless we found like something that totally reverses everything we know about history, I don't think that there'd be anything that could change my mind about like the Bible and its truth. Because there's very obviously some things that are not there. There are a lot of things in the Bible that are not true. If you're talking about like the Gospels, specifically about Jesus's life, the problem that I have with one of the major problems I have with the Gospels is that they don't cite their sources. So like we don't have any sources for like where they got this information. If we could somehow find like an authentic firsthand account of Jesus and the things that he did, that would change my mind. But the problem is that would be really hard because you're looking at a very, very small time frame. Because if you think about it, Jesus supposedly died in the 30s, right? And then you have the 70s is when the Gospels are being written. So you've only got a 40-year time span right there where you have to find some kind of like written piece of work that describes this Jesus that's totally independent from like Paul and other Christians at the time. So it's a very difficult thing to find, but that would have to be the criteria for like to change my opinion on that.
I mean, doesn't John mention like these are written from first-hand accounts? Like I've talked to people who were there. Sorry, when I say John, I mean the anonymous author of the Book of John.
Right. Yeah. Well, see, the problem is though, is that when you do textual analysis on the Book of John, you have a very blatant fact that John is using the other Gospels in order to create his narrative. Because I don't know how you reconcile this, but you know that there's two totally different Lazaruses in the Gospels.
No, I don't. Well, I don't believe in any of the Bible, so I don't. I just like I think a lot of it is just I think a lot of it is just people not making up stuff, but people like recording stuff they heard, and then details get wrong. I didn't know that there were two different Lazarus. So.
Oh yeah, well okay. So, do you recall the Lazarus in Luke? How it's a parable about Lazarus is he's going to, or he's in hell or something like that, and he wants to be saved, but he can't be saved, and he can't like I can't remember what it is. He's like in the bosom of Abraham or something like that.
He wants like water to be put on his tongue or something.
Maybe I don't know that, and I can't remember the exact parable, but in Luke, it's a parable about this poor man named Lazarus, right? But then John comes along, and he doesn't like that story, and so he rewrites Lazarus to be a physical resurrection, because in the Lazarus story in Luke, it's basically there's no miracle that I could do that would convince people, that I'm the prophet, or that would convince people to believe in me. But the exact opposite message is in John. John uses the resurrection of Lazarus to convince everybody immediately about his prophet status, and how he's the prophet of God. And so this is one instance where there's a direct connection between the two, where John is refuting these prior gospels. So uh, could John have gotten eyewitness testimony, considering that he was most likely written in the 2nd century? I doubt it. But at the same time, just like with the other gospels, if you have first-hand accounts, then why do you need to copy other accounts in order to create your account? So I all of the gospels, well, Luke's gospel, and then I guess maybe John's gospel claims to have eyewitness accounts, but both of them claim it, but they never really give any kind of source, like indications of who these people were, why they would have been good sources to use in the first place. So there's nothing that we can say about them, just that they claim that they're eyewitness accounts. But then there's that conflict with copying the other gospels. So it's kind of weird.
Interesting. Is it possible to prove or disprove the historical existence of Jesus anymore, due to the Gospels being far too religiously centric, and the historical records being far too away and not accurate or detailed enough?
Well, see, that's where the real interesting conversation exists, and typically it's between a couple of atheists that the interesting conversation happens, because we can't say for 100% certain whether or not Jesus existed. I think the hardest position that you could take is agnosticism on it, right? Like, I just don't know, because we don't have good records, we don't have any kind of good indications, and you can make sense of the evidence that we have, given the idea that Jesus was historical and given the idea that he was celestial. So there's not really any kind of idea, as to whether or not he was historical, at least not in a very uncertain way, right? Or a certain way. We can't be certain about it. But that's where the interesting conversation exists, because then you're having to try to explain the evidence that we have, and you have to come out as either being, well, he was more likely to be historical, or he was more likely to be mythical and this celestial figure. So it really depends there, like which side you land on. As soon as you can get past like all the gospel nonsense and everything like that, when you're dealing with the nitty gritty history of it, you just really can't say for sure. So unless we find new information, I don't think that we'll really be able to determine whether or not he was historical, like as far as 100%.
Yeah. What would convince you? What books would you recommend?
Oh, okay. Definitely. So there are some really good books. Obviously, Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus. It's a thick read. It's a pretty thick boy.
It is a thick boy.
Yeah. So that's a good one. But as far as like something that's a little bit more pop level, Carrier has his new book, Jesus from Outer Space. That is very pop level. It doesn't have all the nitty gritty details as On the History of Jesus does, but it does have him explaining the whole idea in very layman's terms. So there's that. Then there's also another good book to get is Randall Helm's Gospel Fictions. And this is more about how the Gospels were created using the Old Testament scriptures. And they go through like all the miracles. They go through information about Jesus and how that's lifted from the Old Testament. Randall Helms does a pretty good job of that. There are some things in there that are not exactly supported buy the evidence. It's more speculative, but you can definitely tell when he's being more speculative than he is more empirical, because like when he's referencing like the connection between the New Testament and the Old Testament, he actually has quotes that he pulls out and he shows you how the Greek is exactly the same here and here, kind of thing. So you can easily determine that. But you've also got David Fitzgerald is a good book to get started with. He's got 4 books currently on the topic of mythicism. He's got his first one, Nailed, which kind of introduces you to the topic. And then he's got his 3 books, which, fun fact, I did the cover art for his 3 books, Jesus Mything in Action.
Wow.
I did. Yeah, I did the cover art, like even the back cover and everything like that for that. But he's got 3 books there that kind of explain it. The first book in that series is actually really important because he does like an independent study of the degree granting institutions in the United States and shows that a majority of them require statements of faith in order to either go there or work there. And so that's a pretty big compromise on the academic integrity of the field in general. So it's that's where you can find that. And let's see, John Dominic Crossan's Power of Parable. That's a really good book if you're looking to see how the Gospels are constructed as long parables. He's got a lot of great stuff in there. There's so many books out there that I could recommend, but as far as the ones that anybody can kind of pick up and sort of read, those are the ones that I'd probably go to.
Oh, awesome. There's all the links will be in the description for anyone who's interested. There's also, did you mention because you mentioned when we had a conversation, you mentioned a book called Questioning the Historicity of Jesus. Is that another good one?
Yeah, it is a good one, but it's a little unattainable because it's marketed towards university libraries and stuff. So it's like $200 or more.
I think I was going to buy it, and I was like, "Oh,
it's a little, it's a little too much." But I will say the best thing about Raphael's book is that he foregoes like all of the apologetics about the historicity of Jesus, right? And he focuses in on the most recent defense of the historical Jesus from an atheist, which is Bart Ehrman. And but the problem is that Bart Ehrman employs a lot of dubious tactics in order to make his case, and that's what Raphael Lataster really highlights really well in that book, is how dubious the case that Bart Ehrman makes actually is. And so it's really good for that, but I definitely would not suggest buying it for $200.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, links in the description if anyone wants to buy it for $200. So I've got a couple of last quick questions that are kind of a bit fun. Well, there's 2 that are kind of serious, and then 1 that's just fun. Okay. So regarding, so this is a bit different. This is similar to the one we just had, but a bit different. Regarding mythicism, what, if anything, would change your mind?
What, if anything, would change my mind? Like I said, finding some kind of independent account of Jesus that exists prior to the Gospels being written, and we can verify is independent, from all other like Christian writings at the time. I think that would be a really good start. I think that that would at least probably push me onto the side of most likely historicity. But other than that, like just finding one piece of information that could only exist because Jesus was a historical figure is finding that independent account would be an example of that. The one thing that, or at least one thing that could only exist if Jesus was a historical figure. And just to give you an example, like with Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon, there's a lot of things in history that just simply wouldn't have happened unless Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. And so if you take Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon out, then you don't have an explanation for why all those other things happened. and Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon explains everything perfectly. So if we could find something like Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon for Jesus, in that like these subsequent events just simply wouldn't have happened at all if Jesus had been a historical person. And I don't think that we actually have that piece of information right now. Like, I think that everything that came after Jesus supposedly died or whatever, it makes sense on a celestial figure just as much as it makes sense on a historical figure. But if we could find that one piece of information that was, wholly predicated on him being a historical figure, then I would be swayed towards the historicist side.
Awesome. Okay. Very similar again, but regarding this is much broader regarding your God belief. So this is not just Christian God, but any God, creator of the universe. What, if anything, would change your mind?
Okay, it's a good question. I think that typically what I say is that we would need to find, something that could only be explained by a suspension of the natural order of reality. So, like, which a lot of people would interpret that as being a miracle. I don't think it necessarily has to be a miracle per se, but we would just need to be able to determine that, for one thing, the natural order of reality isn't as uniform as we've known it to be, so that it can be interrupted sporadically and randomly. And if we can somehow prove that happens, then I think that would get me closer to believing that a God could exist. But in order to prove any certain definition of God, you would have to do like a lot of work, like in order to prove that a specific God exists. Because I don't think that I'm very hard atheist, Gnostic atheist on all the current definitions of God. So it would have to be some kind of, definition of God that we just simply don't have right now.
Interesting. Okay. And this is a fun question, because obviously as an atheist, as a heathen, you probably believe that when you die, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You probably go to the same place you were before your birth for the last 13.8 billion years. You probably go to the same place that a flame goes when you blow out a candle. But if you could choose an afterlife and then it would immediately become true if you chose it, what would you choose from any religion?
From any religion? Okay, so have you seen the movie The Invention of Lying?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, in that, Ricky Gervais, has everybody believing that you get a mansion when you go to heaven, right?
Yeah.
I would choose that heaven, like just the heaven, the heaven where I've got a mansion and it's just like, I do whatever I want, for eternity. I'm up there playing video games or doing whatever in the fuck, with my family and everything like that. Like I'm just up there, relaxing, being all, I guess, fresh princey about it. Like if I could choose a heaven, it would probably be that. Or if not a mansion, just, I guess, living out eternity here with my wife, Casey, and just not having to work. If I could just fuck off from work for eternity, that would be heaven, actually.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Deep Drinks podcast, John. It's been awesome to have you on. Everyone, make sure you go check out John's channel, Godless Engineer. Have you got a clips channel as well? Is that correct? I heard you before.
Oh yeah, so it's just called Godless Engineer Shorts, I think, because I had envisioned it to be like those shorts, the vertical video, like 1 minute clips, but I just ended up putting like clips of my actual content on it. So it's just Godless Engineer Shorts.
Yeah, and do you have any like recommended debates or videos that people should watch if they want to learn more about you or what you do?
So my Kent Hovind debate that I did is actually pretty good, and it's the origin story of the whale dick, the whale penis meme that we have on the channel. So it's got a great moment in it where Kent Hovind calls me a pervert and everything. So that debate's pretty good. But pretty much any of my debates that I've done, I mean, I would definitely tell people to watch. You get a sense of my personality in them, especially the Kent Hovind one, because I don't take Kent Hovind seriously at
No
all.
one.
So,
Who does? Like who
don't know.
does? Like I'm surprised that anyone takes him seriously. Like I'm still working on how I'm going to meme like through a debate with him, because I really want to debate him, but I've just got to work out how am I going to troll him through the debate, because obviously there's no content that comes from it besides just having a good laugh.
Right. So I guarantee you he'll start talking about how whales fuck underwater. Okay. It never fails for whatever reason, if you notice it. And yeah, whenever he starts talking about evolution and especially vestigial limbs, he will always pull a whale dick out of his back pocket. Okay. He'll talk about how they've got a 15-foot penis and how they just sort of wiggle it around in the darkness down there, hoping to get some. And I don't know why he brings it up every time, but he does.
Oh, my favorite thing is Dr. Josh doing the not Kent Hovind like raps and stuff like that. If I'm like having the worst day of my life, like watch that. Well, my name's Kent Hovind, call me Dr. T-Rex. I just lose it, and his little like his throat clears and stuff. I love it so much.
I'm here to help. Okay.
Yeah, so good. Oh, well, anyway, thanks so much, John, for coming on. This has been an amazing interview. I've learned so much about mythicism. I still feel like I've got many questions, so I'm going to go to your channel to learn more about learn more about those questions that I have, and I'm sure everyone else will as well. Thank you for coming on, and I'll see you next time.
All right. See everybody later.